engraved on a silver bracelet, placed on the wrist of a woman who had spent 5 years believing she belonged to no one. She didn't earn it with money. She didn't earn it with loyalty oaths or bloodlines. She earned it on a stormy September night by jumping 50 feet into a black canal to rescue a pregnant stranger she had never met, and spending 7 minutes refusing to let her die. The woman she saved was a mafia boss's sister. The mafia boss was the enemy of the husband she was running from. And the word on that bracelet? It became the most powerful shield she had ever worn. This channel tells the stories that live in that space, where mafia bosses grieve like fathers, where strangers become sisters, where the meaning of family is written not in contracts, but in sacrifice. If that world pulls at something inside you, this is your home. The gift this story offers. Family is not always where you were born. Sometimes it is where you were brave enough to stay. If that silver bracelet and one word just cracked your heart wide open, like this video, leave a comment telling us which moment hit hardest. Share it with someone you love and subscribe. We will be here every week with another story worth feeling.
The apartment on the 42nd floor was like a castle in the clouds, overlooking the whole of Chicago. Massive windows mirrored the sparkling city below, giving the impression of infinite space and liberty. For Brooke Sinclair, however, it was just a beautiful prison. She perched on the side of her bed, her fingers laced together, staring at the clock. 11:43 p.m. Preston was due home any second. His government functions always wrapped up around this time, and she had a very clear picture of the condition her husband would be in when he walked through the door. Intoxicated. Not so much that he would be unsteady on his feet, but just enough for the polished image of a public servant to crack, revealing the cruel man hiding underneath. 5 years ago, Brooke had crossed paths with Preston Hale at a benefit event in the city. She was only 23 at the time, a recent physical therapy graduate trying to figure out her path. Preston showed up looking like a hero from a movie, dressed in an expensive suit. He was 33, the most junior federal prosecutor ever appointed in Chicago, and had a smile that could disarm anyone. He promised to keep her safe, to handle all of her problems. She was naive back then, and she mistook his offer for love. She did not realize that in Preston's mind, to protect something meant to own it completely. The hum of their private elevator arriving brought Brooke crashing back to reality. She could hear his heavy shoes on the hardwood floor. A leather bag hit the couch with a loud thump. Then, the door to their bedroom flew open. Preston was framed in the doorway, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot from liquor. But it was not his drunkenness that sent a chill down Brooke's spine. It was the bundle of documents he was holding. Her bank records. "What was the promise you made to me, Brooke?" Preston's voice was quiet, even more so than normal, which was what made it so frightening. He never raised his voice when his rage was real. "You were dishonest with me. $1,000, transferred each month to that addict in California." Preston started walking toward her. Every step was like a drumbeat of doom. "Keith is my brother. He is trying to recover. I was only trying to help him." Brooke never got to say the rest. Preston's hand seized her wrist, twisting it with such force that the agony brought her down to the floor. He pulled her into the large walk-in closet, threw her in, and shut the heavy door. She heard the deadbolt slide into place with a definitive click. "You will remain in there until I figure out your punishment." For 48 hours, Brooke was trapped in that dark space. Her only supplies were a single bottle of water and some snack bars that the maid secretly pushed under the door. She did not weep. Her tears had dried up years ago. In their place, a resolve began to form. On the morning of the third day, Preston departed for a 2-day work trip to the capital. Before he left, he unlocked the door and stared at Brooke as if she were a damaged object. "When I return, we are going to talk, very seriously, about what happens to you next." The door clicked shut. The sound of a helicopter from the building's roof grew loud, then slowly disappeared. Brooke gave it an extra hour to be absolutely sure he was gone. Then, she put her plan into motion. She faked intense stomach pain, writhing on the ground with such convincing agony that the housekeeper unlocked the door in a panic. The water the maid gave her contained 2 crushed sleeping pills. 15 minutes after that, the housekeeper was unconscious on the living room couch. Brooke moved quickly. She entered Preston's home office, the single space in the apartment that was off limits to her. With a numeric code she had secretly memorized years before, she unlocked his desk. Inside, she discovered a tiny black flash drive. She had no idea of its contents. She only knew that Preston protected it like it was his own heart, and an object that valuable to him could be her key to survival. She hid the drive inside a paperback book in her purse, grabbed the emergency money she had stashed in a feminine hygiene box under the bathroom sink, and walked into the elevator. As the metal doors closed, Brooke saw herself in the polished surface. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her skin was ghostly, her gaze was empty, but deep within her eyes there was a glint of determination that she believed had vanished years before. A decision. She had no destination in mind. All that mattered was putting as much distance as she could between herself and Preston before he found out she had fled. Brooke avoided using any ride-sharing apps. She was well aware that Preston could track any activity linked to her identity, from bank cards to cell phone data. So, she traveled 7 blocks on foot in the chilly Chicago air until she spotted a traditional yellow taxi waiting near a budget hotel. She paid in cash, offered no name, and asked no questions. Her first stop was the bus terminal located on the outskirts of town. There, she purchased a fare to Indianapolis using crumpled bills and spare change, and chose a seat at the very rear of the bus. She kept the bill of her hat pulled down to obscure her features. During the whole 4-hour journey, she never closed her eyes. With each new stop to let people on, a wave of terror washed over her. She knew Preston would notice her absence by sunrise. He would be furious, and wielding the authority of his office, he could activate a nationwide search to bring her back. A bleak morning met Brooke in Indianapolis, along with a persistent, cold drizzle that coated every surface. She began to navigate her way to a pre-owned auto dealership on the city limits. The cars were lined up like forgotten toys, hoping for a new owner. She spotted an old Honda CR-V. The silver paint was dull and worn, but the motor sounded reliable. The proprietor, an older gentleman from Mexico, did not probe for details as Brooke laid out the cash, bill by bill, on his desk. There was no title transfer, no record of the sale, only a set of keys. And just like that, she vanished. Brooke did not drive directly south, anticipating that would be what Preston expected. She headed up into Minnesota first, before looping down through Iowa and then slicing through Missouri. Every new state line she crossed was another wall built between them. Each mile was a small victory against the monster she called a husband, but no amount of distance could silence the fear. On the lonely highways, the sight of a patrol car in her mirror sent a jolt of pure dread through her. Any car that followed her for too long felt like it was being driven by Preston himself. Her meals came from convenience stores, she slept in the back of her car at empty shopping centers, and she used public facilities to clean up. She had become invisible, and that was exactly how she needed to be. On her second day of driving, she stopped next to a scrapyard in a tiny Tennessee town. In a heap of decaying metal, she spotted a wrecked car that still had its tags. She took the license plate off her own vehicle and swapped it with the one from the junker. She knew this was a serious crime, but when faced with the choice of jail or returning to Preston, she willingly took the chance. She entered Mississippi, where the thick, humid air of the deep South hung heavy. She spotted a payphone outside a rundown gas station and stood beside it for a full 10 minutes, gathering the nerve to make the call. She knew the number for the treatment facility in California by heart. It rang 3 times before she heard a voice she knew. Is that you, sis? Keith's voice was much clearer than the last time she heard it. It was firm, without the shaky quality of someone battling their demons. Are you all right? Brooke fought to keep her own voice from breaking. I heard you're getting close to finishing the treatment. Just 2 more weeks, he said. But sis, where are you calling from? This number's strange. Is Preston home? Brooke shut her eyes tightly. She desperately wanted to tell Keith the truth about all the years of everything. About the locked room, about her frantic and desperate escape. But she knew she could not. Keith was recovering. He needed to be at peace, not weighed down by another problem. I will be all right, Keith. I just needed to hear your voice. But you have to give me your word on something. What is it? Do not come looking for me. And if Preston calls, you do not know a thing. You have not talked to me. You have no idea where I am. Do you get it? A long silence hung between them. Then Keith's voice returned, softer this time, and filled with concern. What did he do to you? Brooke ended the call before her tears had a chance to fall. She stood there for a few more moments, pressing her forehead against the cold phone, making herself breathe until the pain in her chest subsided. Then she returned to her car and just kept driving. On the third day, the Florida state line came into view as the sun began to set, painting the sky in a fiery orange that soon faded into a deep violet. The car radio played repeated alerts about a tropical storm heading for the waters near Miami. People were being told to stay inside. Roads along the coast could be closed. Brooke knew she should have stopped, found a motel for the night, and let the storm blow over. But the fear she had of Preston was stronger than her fear of the weather. Continued driving south to Miami, straight into the storm. At 11:30 that night, the Palm Island Bridge appeared out of the rain, a thin strip of concrete that seemed to hang above a black void. Deep canals flanked both sides, with dark water churning in violent waves. The wind howled in fierce gusts, powerful enough to rattle the Honda as if it were a dried leaf. The rain was not falling, it was flying sideways, hitting the windshield like a million tiny pebbles. Brooke gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her eyes straining to see into the sheet of water. She could not see more than 30 feet in front of her. This was a bad idea. She was certain it was a bad idea, but it was too late to go back. Suddenly, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness from behind. Brooke glanced in her rearview mirror, and her heart began to hammer against her ribs. 3 black Escalades with tinted windows were approaching her in a tight line, like a military escort. The first vehicle flashed its high beams. Without thinking, Brooke moved into the right lane to let them pass. The 3 sport utility vehicles flew by her like massive dark phantoms. For a fleeting second, through the rain-covered window of the middle vehicle, Brooke saw a small person in the back seat. It was a young woman, and her hand was resting on the swell of her pregnant belly. The convoy disappeared ahead of her into the rain. Brooke drove on across the bridge, fighting to keep her car from swerving in the powerful gusts of wind. She had no idea who those people were in that convoy. She did not need to know. Her only goal was to cross the bridge, find a safe place, and make it through the night. But destiny had something else in store. 200 meters ahead, the 3 Escalades suddenly hit their brakes. Their red taillights blazed through the downpour like the fiery eyes of demons. And from the other direction, a truck came speeding toward them. It had no lights on. It did not honk. It was just a huge piece of metal flying through the night with deadly intent. 3 seconds. That was all it took. Only 3 seconds. But for Brooke, time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity. Every moment was seared into her memory like a scene from a nightmare. In the first second, the truck without headlights smashed directly into the lead Escalade with incredible force. The shriek of crushing metal sounded like a monster tearing its prey apart. The truck's front end hit the side of the sport utility vehicle, sending it spinning 90 degrees. Sparks shot through the rain like deadly fireworks. In the second, the next Escalade slammed on its brakes, but the wet road made it impossible to control. The vehicle swerved, tilted onto its side, and then flipped over, scraping along the pavement on its roof with the piercing sound of steel on concrete. A trail of sparks followed it for 20 meters, like a giant scar carved into the bridge. In the third second, the last Escalade, the one with the pregnant woman inside, had no chance to react. The collision sent it spinning sideways like an out-of-control top. The vehicle slammed into the steel guardrail with incredible power. The guardrail snapped, and the sport utility vehicle plunged over the side, disappearing into the dark, deep canal below. Brooke stomped on the brakes with both of her feet. The Honda spun 90 degrees and slid for 30 meters across the slick pavement. She felt every inch of the slide, as if her own skin was being scraped against the road. Her car finally stopped 50 meters from the crash site, facing the broken guardrail. There was a moment of complete silence. Then all hell broke loose. Doors were thrown open. Men began to climb out of the two Escalades that were still on the bridge. They were dark figures moving with shocking speed, even with their injuries. They did not seem like typical car crash victims. They wore black suits and expensive shirts, and more than one of them held a pistol that gleamed in the headlights. Brooke realized it instantly. These were not businessmen or politicians. This was the mob. A man screamed in Italian, his voice cutting through the storm. "Gianna! Gianna!" One of the men rushed toward the broken guardrail. He was tall with broad shoulders and moved with the power of an injured beast. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead, covering half his face, but he paid it no mind. He stared only at the dark abyss below. "My sister is down there," he yelled in English, his voice raw with anguish. "Let me go. I have to get down there." Two other men grabbed his arms and shoulders, trying to hold him back and stop him from jumping. "You can't, boss. The current is too strong. You will die." "I do not care. That is Gianna. That is my sister." He struggled against them, almost tossing both men aside. The power of his grief was frightening. Brooke sat frozen in her car, her hands still locked on the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Her heart was beating furiously. It was not the crash that scared her, but the chilling truth of what she was witnessing. This was the mob. These were men who would kill someone without a second thought. If she got mixed up in this, if they saw her, if they remembered her face, she would never have a peaceful life again. Every rational thought in her head screamed, "Leave! Drive away right now! You are running from your husband. You cannot let anyone know you were here. This is not your problem." But she could not look away from the man who was yelling into the storm. The agony in his voice stirred something deep within her. She recognized that feeling. She understood the terror of losing someone you love. She knew exactly what it felt like to be completely helpless. Then, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. The truck driver's door flew open, and the driver leaped out. But instead of going to help the victims, he turned and ran in the opposite direction, vanishing into the night like a man who had this all planned out. Brooke blinked. A driver does not run from a crash like that. Not unless it was never an accident to begin with. Not unless it was an assassination. The thought came and went in an instant, because another image had taken over her mind. The pregnant woman in the sport utility vehicle that had fallen off the bridge. She was trapped in that cold, dark water, drowning with her unborn child. Brooke shut off the engine. Her hand moved to the door handle. Reason screamed at her again. "You are crazy. You are going to die. A professional swimmer would be afraid of these currents. You are on the run." But a different voice, quiet and deep, rose from a hidden part of her soul. It whispered, "A mother and her child are dying down there. If you do nothing, you will never be able to live with yourself. You might survive, but the guilt will eat you from the inside out until you are nothing." Brooke pushed her car door open. The wind and rain hit her with the force of a physical blow, as if the storm itself was challenging her, demanding to know if she was sure. She was. She did not know what she could do. She did not know if she would make it out alive. But she knew she could not just sit there and let another woman die when she might have a chance to save her. For 4 long years, she had lived as a helpless victim. But tonight, that was going to change. Brooke ran toward the broken guardrail, toward the men shouting in Italian, and toward the black void that was claiming a human life. Or maybe two. Brooke ran to the broken guardrail, pushing past the men who were shouting in Italian. She peered over the edge, and her heart skipped a beat. 50 feet below, the dark canal was churning violently in the storm. The water had no color, just the dense, lightless black of spilled ink that consumed everything. But then, about 100 feet from the shore, a faint light flickered under the surface. The headlights of the Escalade were still on, shining up from the bottom like the eyes of some monster sinking into the depths. The vehicle was going down, slowly but surely. And then Brooke saw it, the sight that made her forget how to breathe. A hand, small and white, was flailing in the dark water. It was not waving, it was begging for help. The pregnant woman was still alive, but she would not be for much longer. Around Brooke, the mobsters were desperately looking for a way down to the canal, but the embankment was almost a sheer drop, slippery from the rain and covered with sharp rocks. One of the men had already tried to climb down and had slipped, almost falling headfirst onto a large rock before someone pulled him back up. Him. Expensive leather shoes and perfectly tailored suits were not designed for climbing down a ravine or swimming in a storm. "Who in the world are you?" A hand clamped down on Brooke's shoulder, spinning her around. She faced a huge man with a hardened expression, his eyes burning with suspicion. "What are you doing here? Are you involved in this?" Brooke didn't reply. She had no time to explain her story, how she was a woman escaping an abusive husband, trying to vanish from the world with nowhere to go. Instead, her gaze scanned the area, guided by the instincts of a former state-level college swimmer. The canal bank was steep, but a rocky ledge jutted out about 15 feet below. While the water was deep, there were no dangerous whirlpools. The distance from the ledge to the sinking vehicle was roughly 80 feet. It was a difficult challenge, but not an impossible one. In Brooke's mind, an image of Keith flashed like lightning, her brother, lifeless on the bathroom floor. His lips had turned blue from an overdose. She had performed CPR for 10 solid minutes until the ambulance arrived. Keith survived because she refused to walk away. He was alive because she never gave up. Brooke ripped off her jacket and threw it onto the pavement. Then she kicked off, her shoes, her bare feet pressing against the freezing concrete. The man who had been yelling Gianna's name turned, his frantic eyes locking onto Brooke. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, staining one side of his face red, but he seemed completely unaware of it. "What do you think you are doing?" His voice was shattered with despair. Brooke looked him directly in the eyes. She had no idea who he was. She didn't know his profession, how many people he might have hurt, or why someone wanted his sister gone. She understood only one thing. In those bloodshot eyes, she saw the agony of a man about to lose the most important person in his life. "I am going to save your sister." With that, Brooke started running, not down the slippery slope the others had tried to navigate. She ran along the mangled guardrail to a point where the rock ledge was closest to the water, 50 feet above. She had dived from 30 feet in competitions before. This was an extra 20 feet, in a storm, into icy water, toward a sinking car with a drowning pregnant woman inside. Every rational thought screamed that this was a fatal mistake, but Brooke had tuned out reason. She leaped into the 50-foot freefall through the wind and rain. The world dissolved into a blur of darkness, water, and the screech of the wind in her ears like nature itself was wailing. Then she plunged into the water. The impact felt like 1,000 sharp needles piercing her skin all at once. It was a numbing cold, a cold so vicious she nearly gasped, which would have filled her lungs with canal water. Brooke sank 10 feet before her survival instincts took over. Her legs kicked powerfully, her arms sliced through the current, and she propelled herself back to the surface. Waves crashed against her, pushing her toward the rocky bank and away from her goal. But Brooke was a swimmer. She knew how to interpret the current. She knew how to move across the water at an angle to avoid being carried away. She swam toward the dimming light, toward the vehicle that was sinking deeper with each passing moment. Her lungs started to ache. Her muscles began to protest against the cold and the exertion. But she kept going. The light got closer. Then Brooke dived under the surface. A black shroud of darkness enveloped her. The freezing water created an intense pressure against her eardrums. She swam toward the headlights, toward the faint outline of the SUV tilting further downward, and then, through the side window, she saw her. A pair of eyes stared directly at her. They were the eyes of the pregnant woman, wide with terror, but also filled with hope. She was awake. She was alive. And she was looking at Brooke as if she were an angel sent from the heavens to rescue her. The Escalade was going down more quickly than Brooke had anticipated. Underwater, the headlights began to flicker erratically, as if they were sending out a final distress signal before the battery failed completely. Brooke swam to the driver's side door, where Gianna was trapped. Through the glass, she could see the young woman desperately trying to push the door open with both hands. But the immense water pressure from the outside held it firm. The door wouldn't budge an inch. The water had already risen to Gianna's chest and was climbing higher by the second. Brooke placed her hand on the window, signaling for Gianna to look at her. She tried to communicate a single message with her eyes. "Stay calm. I will get you out. Do not panic." Gianna nodded, but her eyes were still wide with fear. One hand instinctively clutched her swollen stomach, as if trying to protect her unborn child from the fate that was closing in on them. Brooke tried the door handle herself. It was stuck fast. The force of the water held it shut with the grip of a giant. She had to act quickly. Every moment that passed was another moment Gianna was losing. The back window. Brooke swam around to the rear of the SUV, her lungs screaming for oxygen. Her guess had been correct. The collision with the guardrail had shattered the rear window, creating an opening just large enough for a person to get through. But surrounding the opening were sharp, jagged pieces of glass, glittering like a shark's teeth in the fading glow of the headlights. Brooke did not pause. She pushed herself through the broken window. A sharp piece of glass sliced into her left arm, creating a long gash from her elbow to her wrist. She knew she was bleeding and could see the water around her turning into a faint red cloud. But she felt nothing. Adrenaline coursed through her veins like electricity, numbing every sensation her body did not need to feel. Inside the vehicle, the water had already reached Gianna's neck. She was crying, her tears invisible in the murky water. One hand still held her belly, while the other fumbled desperately with the seatbelt buckle. It was stuck. Brooke lunged toward her and tried to release the belt. It would not give. The mechanism was either damaged from the crash or the electrical system was shorted out. She needed something to cut it. Glass. Brooke turned back to the shattered window and broke off a large piece, big enough to hold firmly in her hand. It was as sharp as a razor blade. She returned to Gianna and began sawing at the seatbelt with the edge of the glass. Just then, the headlights went out. Absolute darkness fell upon them like a heavy black curtain, consuming everything. Brooke could no longer see anything at all. She could only feel. She felt the tough fabric of the seatbelt under her hand. She felt the back and forth sawing motion. She felt the fibers slowly giving way, one by one. And then, finally, the belt broke free. Gianna was released. Brooke grabbed Gianna's wrist and pulled her toward the broken rear window. Gianna held onto Brooke like a drowning person clings to life itself, her fingernails digging painfully into Brooke's skin. But Brooke held on tight. The two of them squeezed through the opening just as the vehicle tilted vertically and began its final plunge to the bottom of the canal. The powerful current swirling around the sinking SUV almost pulled them down with it. Brooke kicked with all her might, breaking them away from the suction. And that is when the true fight for survival began. The surface was above them, far above them. Brooke had lost all track of how long she had been underwater. 3 minutes, maybe 4, perhaps even longer. Her lungs were on fire. Every cell in her body cried out for oxygen. And she was pulling a woman who was 6 months pregnant. Brooke kicked. She locked one arm across Gianna's chest from behind, while her other arm pulled them through the water. It was the life-saving technique she had learned in college. But learning the theory was one thing. Executing it in the dark, in freezing water, with lungs about to burst, was an entirely different reality. Up, she told herself. Up, up. Her legs moved like pistons. Her thighs burned, her calves cramped, but she refused to stop. She could not stop. A faint light appeared above them. It was dim, but it was light. The surface. Brooke summoned every last ounce of her remaining strength for one final push, and then they broke through. The air was cold and heavy with rain, but it was air. Brooke opened her mouth and gasped, her chest heaving as if she had been brought back from the dead. Gianna emerged with her. She coughed violently, spitting up salt water, but she was breathing. She was alive. But they were not safe yet. The waves continued to batter them, pushing them toward the riverbank was a deadly line of jagged rocks. If the current smashed them into that stone at this speed, neither of them would make it. Brooke shifted her weight, angling her body across the current, instead of fighting it directly. She set her sights on a flatter section of rock about 50 feet away. 50 feet. It felt like a mile. With a woman 6 months pregnant clinging to her back in a raging storm, and her own body screaming from the long minutes spent underwater, Brooke's legs started to seize up. First, it was her left calf, tightening in a knot of pure agony, like a cruel hand was crushing the muscle with a pair of pliers. Then her right thigh locked up. She fought the urge to scream, terrified that opening her mouth would only mean swallowing more of the churning water. Feeling was already gone from her arms. She could not even feel her own fingers. Her body was shutting down, one part at a time. 20 more feet. Brooke had no clue where the last bit of strength came from. Maybe it was the picture of Keith, lifeless on the bathroom floor all those years ago. Maybe it was the memory of surviving 4 years as Preston's prisoner. Or maybe it was the flicker of hope she saw in Gianna's eyes right when Brooke reached her under the water. Brooke would not give up. 10 feet. A powerful wave threw her against a boulder, but she twisted at the last second, taking the impact on her own back to shield Gianna. Pain exploded through her body. It might have been a broken rib. She did not know. She did not care. 5 feet. Brooke's hand finally scraped against the flat rock ledge. She latched on and started to pull, dragging Gianna with her inch by grueling inch until they were both splayed across the stone. Their lower bodies were still in the water, but their heads were finally above the surface. Brooke gasped for air, her chest burning as if it had been ripped open. She turned to check on Gianna, and her heart froze. Gianna was completely still. Her eyes were closed. Her lips had a terrifying blue tint. Her chest was not moving. She was not breathing. Brooke forced herself not to think. She acted on pure instinct, on the training that had been drilled into her during her years as a physical therapist. She carefully laid Gianna flat on the smooth rock. She tilted her head back, clearing the airway. She placed one hand over the other in the center of Gianna's chest, directly on the breastbone. Then she started the compressions. 30 chest compressions. 2 rescue breaths. Repeat. Brooke counted silently, keeping the rhythm steady in her mind. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her arms were already on fire with exhaustion after that swim against death, but she refused to stop. 5, 6, 7. Gianna's chest compressed under Brooke's weight and rose again. There was no response. 15, 16, 17. Gianna's lips were still blue. Her eyes remained shut. Her chest refused to rise on its own. 1 minute crawled by. Nothing. Brooke forced 2 breaths into Gianna's mouth, then immediately returned to compressions. 2 minutes. Rain whipped against Brooke's face in a relentless series of stings, but she barely felt it. Her entire world was the count, the steady push and release of her hands, and the fragile hope that this woman would somehow open her eyes. 3 minutes. Still nothing. A tiny voice whispered in the back of her mind, "She is already gone. You failed. Just give up." But Brooke knew that voice. 5 years ago, When Keith was the one lying motionless on the bathroom floor, she had ignored it. She was going to ignore it now. 4 minutes. A shout echoed from above, slicing through the roar of the storm. Someone was making their way down the steep bank of the canal. Is she alive? Is she breathing? Brooke did not look up. She did not answer. She had no breath for words. There was no time for words. She just kept pushing. 28, 29, 30. Breathe, breathe, and repeat. 5 minutes. Brooke's hands started to tremble, not from the cold, but from complete and total exhaustion. Her muscles had passed their limit long ago. Now they were running on nothing but pure willpower. But even willpower has a breaking point. 6 minutes. A shadow fell over her. She saw a pair of expensive leather shoes, now caked with mud. Black suit pants were soaked completely through. Then a face came into her view. It was the man from the bridge. He had climbed all the way down. The blood from the gash on his forehead was diluted by the rain, leaving pale pink streaks down his cheeks. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from absolute despair. Let me do it. His voice was hoarse and broken. You are exhausted. Let me take over. Brooke shook her head, never pausing the compressions. I know what I'm doing, she managed to say between ragged breaths. Do not touch her. The man went quiet. He took a step back but did not leave. He just stayed there on his knees, watching his sister lie there without moving, watching a complete stranger fight to bring her back from the edge of death. 7 minutes. Brooke pushed down one final time with every last bit of strength she had. Her entire body felt like it was about to collapse. Her head was spinning from a lack of oxygen. She had lost all feeling in her hands. And then, Gianna coughed. It was just one weak cough, but it was a sound. Water poured from her mouth and nose. She instinctively rolled onto her side, choking and gasping, throwing up a mixture of seawater and rain. She was breathing. She was alive. Gianna's eyes fluttered open, hazy and full of confusion. Her lips moved, trying to make words. Brooke had to lean in very close to understand her. My baby, Gianna whispered, her voice barely audible. Is my baby alive? Brooke gently placed a hand on Gianna's stomach. She was not a doctor. She did not have an ultrasound machine, but she felt a tiny, faint movement just under the skin. The baby was still kicking. Alive. You are both alive, Brooke said, unsure if the moisture on her face was from the rain or from her own tears. The man rushed forward and pulled his sister into his arms, holding her as if he was afraid she would disappear if he ever let go. He did not say a single word. He just held her close, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Brooke collapsed onto the rock ledge, with no energy left to stand or even kneel. Her body was shaking uncontrollably from the cold, the exhaustion, and the aftershock that hits when the adrenaline finally fades. Then the man raised his head and looked at her. For the very first time, they were truly seeing each other. The chaos of the crash was gone. The madness of the rescue was over. It was just two people, soaked to the bone and completely spent, meeting each other's gaze in the dark, stormy night. His eyes were as dark as a bottomless pit, but deep inside them, Brooke saw something she never expected: gratitude. It was not the polite, casual kind of thanks. This was the raw, pure gratitude of a man who had just gotten back the single most important person in his life. He stood up and offered his hand to her. You need to see a doctor. His voice was low and calm now. Your arm is bleeding. Come with me. Brooke stared at the hand reaching for her. The hand of a mobster. The hand of the criminal underworld. If she took it, she would be stepping into a world she could not even imagine. But what else could she do? She could never go back to Chicago. She had no other place to go, and she had just saved this man's sister. Brooke took his hand. Everything that followed happened so quickly that Brooke had no time to process it. An ambulance materialized out of the darkness, almost like it was summoned. It was not a standard white van with the flashing lights of a city hospital. This was a sleek black vehicle with no markings at all. The back doors burst open, and two people in medical scrubs hurried out with a stretcher and emergency gear. They worked with the efficiency of a highly trained team, lifting Gianna onto the stretcher while an older man with short silver hair started to check her vital signs. A private doctor. This family had their own private doctor. Brooke just stood there as they loaded Gianna into the van. She felt completely out of place among these men in black suits who moved like parts of a well-oiled machine. This was not her world. She had to get out of there. Her Honda was still parked up on the bridge. If she could just slip away while they were all busy with Gianna, they might not even notice her leaving. Brooke took one step back, then another, and then a third. Just as she turned to run, a firm hand clamped down on her elbow. "You are not going anywhere." The voice was quiet and as cold as steel. Brooke turned to see the man who was holding her. He looked to be around 50, with salt and pepper hair slicked back and a sharp, chiseled face with eyes as hard as razor blades. Nothing about him suggested he was friendly or open to discussion. "You just saved the boss's sister," he said, his voice perfectly steady. "Did you honestly think we would let you leave without finding out who you are?" "I am just a person passing by," Brooke said, trying to keep her own voice steady. "I have nothing to do with any of this. I just want to get my car and go." He looked at her observed her with the cold, detached gaze of a scientist examining a specimen under glass. "We will let you go once we understand who you are and what you were doing there." He then gestured to two huge men positioned close by. They flanked Brooke, moving to her side. They never laid a hand on her, but their presence sent a crystal-clear message. Escaping was no longer a possibility. 30 minutes later, Brooke was on the deck of a magnificent yacht docked at a private pier on an island. The vessel was easily 50 meters long, with a sleek design and dark, tinted windows. Stepping inside was like entering another reality of polished oak, buttery Italian leather, and art that Brooke knew was more valuable than the apartment she used to call home. An older woman guided her to a cabin on the lower deck. The room was large, featuring a double bed with fresh white linens and an attached bathroom with a marble tub. A fresh change of clothes was waiting on the bed, and a tray of warm food sat on a nearby table. It was opulent, it was comfortable, but it was still a prison. Brooke saw that the bedroom door had no lock on the inside. When she peered out into the corridor, a large man stood with his arms crossed over his chest, looking straight forward. He was not there to keep her safe. He was there to make sure she stayed put. Brooke could not sleep that night. She stayed by the circular porthole, gazing out at Biscayne Bay, where the water had settled after the storm. Far in the distance, the lights of Miami twinkled like a separate galaxy she could see but could never touch. She had escaped from Preston, from that penthouse, from 4 years of his control and cruelty. Now, she found herself on a mobster's yacht, under the watch of men far more menacing than her former husband. The sheer irony of her situation was almost enough to make her laugh. The following morning, the doctor with silver hair from the previous night came to her room. He said his name was Webb, just Webb, no last name. He inspected the gash on Brooke's arm, closing it with 12 precise stitches before dressing it with the skill of a surgeon who had performed the task thousands of times. "Gianna and the baby are doing well," he reported while putting his medical tools away. "She is awake and has been asking for the woman who saved her life. What you did was truly remarkable, young lady. Very few people could have managed what you did last night." Brooke remained silent. She was not interested in compliments. She was interested in being free. Later that afternoon, her door swung open and the man from the bridge entered the room. He was the one who had cried out Gianna's name in such agony, the one who had clutched his sister on that rock in the heart of the storm. But the person standing before Brooke today bore no resemblance to the devastated man from the night before. He was dressed in a perfectly fitted black suit with a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and his dark hair was slicked back. The cut on his forehead was now stitched and covered by a small bandage. He resembled the chief executive officer of a massive corporation more than a crime boss. But his eyes told the real story. They were cold, sharp, and threatening. "Who are you?" He offered no greeting, no words of thanks, just that single question. He shot it at her like a weapon. Brooke had rehearsed for this confrontation. She had spent the entire night planning what she would say. "My name is Sarah Miller," she stated, her voice steady and calm. "I was just driving to Miami when I saw the wreck. I saw that someone was in trouble, so I helped. That is the whole story." The man stared at her without a word for what felt like an eternity. He then opened a leather briefcase he was carrying, pulled out a folder, and threw it on the table in front of her. "You are lying." His voice was completely devoid of any emotion. Brooke glanced down at the folder. The top page showed a picture of her, the same one from her actual driver's license. Below it was her real name, Brooke Sinclair. On the following page was a different picture of Preston, dressed in a suit on the steps of the federal courthouse, with the self-assured smirk of a truly powerful man. "Your actual name is Brooke Sinclair," the man stated, his tone as frigid as ice. "And your husband is Preston Hale, a federal prosecutor." Brooke looked at the file laid out on the table, feeling the floor drop out from under her. They knew everything, not just her true identity, but her old address, where she used to work, and even a wedding photo with Preston from 5 years ago. In the picture, she was smiling, her face full of the optimism of a 23-year-old woman who thought she had married her prince. She no longer recognized the person in that photo. "Who sent you?" the man across from her demanded, his voice so flat he could have been discussing the weather. "No one," Brooke replied, struggling to keep her voice from trembling. "I told you, I was just passing by." "You are Preston Hale's wife," he interrupted. "He is the federal prosecutor heading the investigation into my family. He has dedicated the last 2 years to trying to lock me and everyone I care about in prison. And you expect me to think that you showing up on the very night my sister was almost murdered was just a simple coincidence?" Brooke blinked. Preston was going after this man's family. The information hit her like a physical punch. During her 4 years married to Preston, she never knew any specifics about his cases. He refused to discuss his job at home, and she was forbidden to ask questions. "I did not know," she said. And this time, she was telling the absolute truth. "I had no idea what Preston was working on. He did not tell me anything. He did not let me know anything. He did not let me do anything." "You want me to believe that?" The man cut her off. "That a federal prosecutor never mentioned the most important case of his career to his own wife?" "Yes." Brooke's voice rose, almost to a shout. "Because he never saw me as his wife. He saw me as a possession, something he could manage, something to show off when he felt like it, and something he could shatter whenever he pleased." A deep silence filled the room. The man with the salt and pepper hair, Nico, who stood by the door, raised an eyebrow just slightly. But the man facing her showed no change in his expression. He continued to look at her as if she were a puzzle to be solved, not a person, sharing the deepest source of her suffering. And at that moment, something inside Brooke shattered. She had tolerated it for 4 years, suffering in silence. Nobody ever believed her. Nobody ever came to help her. And now, after she risked her own life to rescue this man's sister, he still refused to believe her. "You want to know the truth?" Brooke's voice began to tremble, not with fear, but with rage. "Fine, here is the truth. For 4 years, my husband made my life a living hell. He dictated what I ate, what I wore, and who I was allowed to see. He would strike me for any little thing that displeased him. He once locked me in a room for 2 days simply because I had the nerve to send my brother some money. I ran away because if I stayed another day, I knew I would die. Not because he would have killed me, but because I would have taken my own life just to get away from him." She jumped to her feet, the chair screeching loudly as it slid back. "I have no idea who you are. I have no idea who your sister is. All I saw was a pregnant woman who was about to drown, and I jumped in because I could not just stand by and watch another woman die when I knew I could do something to help. If you want to kill me for that, then do it. At least that death would have more meaning than dying by Preston's hand. An intense quiet fell over the room. Brooke stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes red but completely dry. She had wept too much over the last 4 years. There were no more tears to cry. The man in front of her remained silent. He got up, walked over to the window, and turned his back on her. Nico, check her neck. The man with the salt and pepper hair moved toward Brooke. He now looked at her with an expression that was no longer just suspicious, but held something new. Would you mind pulling down your scarf? Brooke was confused, but she did as he asked. She lowered the collar, revealing the skin on her throat and chest. Nico took a look, and for the first time, his stoic expression wavered. There are old bruises here, he said to the man by the window. The pattern matches the grip of a man's hand, and I see a faint scar near her collarbone. This was not a single incident. Then, Nico reached inside his coat and set something down on the table. It was a small, black Universal Serial bus drive. We discovered this with your belongings, Nico explained. Do you know what information it holds? Brooke looked at the drive. It was the one she had snatched from Preston's locked desk drawer, the one she thought could be her leverage if she ever needed it. I do not, she answered truthfully. I just knew it was very important to Preston. I grabbed it, because I figured it could be my protection if I ever had to defend myself. Nico glanced at the man by the window. It holds documentation of the bribes Preston Hale took from the Benedetto family. The man turned and slowly approached the table. Benedetto, our rivals, the very people who attempted to kill my sister last night. The wife of the federal prosecutor targeting my family just happened to save my sister from an assassination plot arranged by my enemies, and she is carrying proof that could ruin both of them, her husband and Benedetto. He paused and gave Brooke a look she could not decipher. This is either the most elaborate setup I have ever encountered, or it is the most unbelievable coincidence in the history of the world. I do not know who Benedetto is, Brooke said. I do not know who you are. I do not know anything. You do not need to, he cut in. You just need to realize that from now on, you will remain here until I figure out how to play this situation to my advantage. You are not a captive, but you are not a guest either. You are a pawn on the chessboard, Brooke Sinclair, and I have not yet decided on my next move. Brooke watched the man exit the room, with Nico right behind him. The door shut with a quiet click. She collapsed into the chair, her thoughts racing. For 4 years, she had been running from Preston's control and his violence. Now she was caught in a war between two dark forces. With a USB drive holding secrets that could ruin them both, she was no longer just Preston's captive. She had become a pawn in a game where she didn't know the rules, and she had no clue which side was more of a threat. A week went by on the yacht, and Brooke's life was now marked by a strict, quiet routine. Breakfast arrived at 7 o'clock, and Dr. Webb came at 10 o'clock to change her bandages. Lunch was served at noon, followed by long, endless afternoons staring at the bay through a small, round window. Dinner was at 7, leading into nights that felt even longer than the days, filled with nightmares about Preston and a single question that haunted her. Where was he? And when would he find out where she had gone? They treated her with a strange and unsettling kindness. The food was excellent, her room was always clean, and nobody bothered her. But a guard still stood outside her door 24 hours a day. She was still a prisoner, just one trapped in a beautiful cage. On the 8th day, the bedroom door swung open, and Brooke could hardly recognize the woman who walked in. Gianna Caruso looked completely different from the woman Brooke had rescued from the canal. Her lips were no longer blue, and her skin had lost that awful paleness from lack of oxygen. She now had a healthy, olive complexion, with long black hair neatly brushed and dark eyes that observed Brooke with both curiosity and gratitude. Her 6-month pregnancy showed as a full curve under a loose, cream-colored dress. So, you are the person who saved me, Gianna said, her voice warm, lacking the suspicion her brother always had. I have been wanting to meet you for days, but the doctor kept me in bed. Brooke was not sure how to respond, so she just gave a nod. Are you all right? I mean, with the baby? Gianna smiled, placing a hand on her belly. He is healthy, kicking like a little boxer every single night. The doctor told me that if you had arrived just 2 minutes later, he would not have survived. You saved two of us. You realize that, right? Gianna walked over to the chair opposite Brooke and sat down, not waiting for an invitation. My brother suspects you might be a spy, she said directly. He sees a conspiracy in everything. It is how he has managed to stay alive in this world. But I do not believe that. Why? Brooke asked. Because a spy would not dive into dark water to save a stranger. Gianna tilted her head, studying her. A spy would have allowed me to die, then approached my family pretending to offer condolences. That would have been the clever move. What you did, putting your own life on the line for someone you did not know, was either the act of a crazy person or someone with a genuinely good heart. And my money is on the second one. They sat quietly for a minute. Then Gianna spoke again, her voice much softer. Tell me about Preston, about everything you went through. Brooke wanted to say no. She was not accustomed to talking about it. For 4 years, she had held it all inside because she had no one to tell, and speaking about it would not have made a difference. But something in Gianna's eyes made her trust her. Maybe it was her sincerity. Maybe it was because Gianna looked at her not with pity, but with understanding. So Brooke started to talk. She told her about Preston, about his sweet promises at the start, about how he gradually isolated her from her family and friends, about the bruises he left in places no one could see, about being locked in a room for 48 hours without food, and about the night she decided that death was a better option than staying. Gianna listened without saying a word. When Brooke finally stopped talking, Gianna reached out and held her hand. Her hand felt small, but it was warm. My mother was in a similar situation, Gianna said in a low voice. She put up with my father for a very long time. In the end, she just could not take it anymore, and she decided to leave when I was 10. She paused, taking a slow breath. But you are not like her. You made the choice to live. You escaped instead of just giving up. That is something my mother could not do. And because of that, I admire you. Gianna stood up, still holding on to Brooke's hand. I am going to have a talk with Jace. You are not our enemy. You are a friend to this family. And if Preston ever thinks about touching you again, he will have to deal with my family. The very next day, Brooke was transferred from the yacht to the main house on Star Island. Her new room was enormous, at least 3 times the size of the old one, with huge windows that looked out over the bay and its own private balcony. The guard outside her door was gone. She was still not permitted to leave the island, but she did not feel like a prisoner anymore. In the following weeks, Brooke found out that Gianna had hurt her leg during the accident. It was not a bad injury, but it required physical therapy to heal completely. And when Gianna discovered that Brooke used to work as a physical therapist, she insisted on her help. They spent 2 hours together every day. Brooke led her through the exercises, and Gianna did them while sharing stories about her life growing up in a mafia family. She talked about a cold, withdrawn brother who would still risk everything to keep her safe. She spoke about the baby she was carrying and the father who was killed in a hit before he even knew he was going to be a dad. Slowly but surely, Brooke began to feel less like an outsider. Word started to spread through the family about the woman who had saved Gianna. One afternoon, Bruno, the family's second-in-command, a huge man who looked like a bear with a scarred face, showed up at Brooke's door. I heard you know a thing or two about back pain, he grumbled. My spine has been giving me trouble for years. The doctors just give me pills. You got anything that works better? After that, Brooke started helping more people. She treated men with injuries she never asked about, dealing with pain whose sources she did not need to understand. She just helped them. and they started to see her in a new light. By the third month, Brooke was given a phone. Gianna gave her a brand new one, telling her she could make one call, and only one. Brooke called Keith. Her brother's voice sounded strong and clear on the other end, more stable than she could ever remember. He had finished his rehab program. He had found a new job at a facility in California that helped addicts, and he was very worried about her. Preston is searching for you everywhere, Keith warned her. He is acting like a complete lunatic. Where are you? Are you okay? Brooke smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in what felt like forever. I am in a safe place. Jace Caruso continued to be a distant figure in Brooke's new life. She hardly ever saw him. He was constantly occupied with his work. Nobody ever gave her the details, but sometimes, when she was out in the garden working with Gianna on her therapy, she would get the feeling that someone was watching her. She would glance up and see him standing on the second-floor balcony, just observing quietly before he would turn and walk away. One evening, Brooke was alone on the balcony of her room, gazing out at Biscayne Bay as it sparkled under the moonlight. She thought about Preston, the penthouse in Chicago, and those 4 years of misery. Then she thought about the last 3 months, about Gianna, and about the intimidating men who had surprisingly started to treat her like one of their own. And then, a strange thought hit her. She was not looking for an escape anymore. For the very first time in her life, she felt like she actually belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was the headquarters of a mafia family. At that same moment, as Brooke stood on her balcony feeling a sense of peace for the first time, more than 2,000 miles north, Preston Hale was in his Chicago penthouse, feeling his control slipping away. 3 months. Brooke had been missing for 3 months, and she had not left a single clue behind. Preston had pulled every string he could. He had reviewed security footage all over the city. He had tracked every credit card and checked every bank account. He had even used his authority as a federal prosecutor to contact police in nearby states, claiming he was searching for a key witness. It was no use. Brooke had disappeared as if she had been erased from existence. And the thing that kept Preston up at night was not just that his wife had found the courage to leave him, it was what she had taken with her. He noticed the USB drive was gone on the very first day he returned to an empty bed. That drive contained evidence of every bribe he had taken over the past 5 years. It had names, dates, dollar amounts, and offshore account numbers. It was enough to end his career, enough to put him in prison for the rest of his life. Brooke had to be silenced, permanently. Preston was no longer interested in bringing her back. He needed to ensure that she would never get the opportunity to say a word. The break in the case came late one night, from a private investigator Preston had paid in cash. Your wife is in Miami, and I do not think you are going to like the rest of this. Preston sat bolt upright in his chair. Tell me, she is staying with the Caruso family. The news hit him like a physical blow. Caruso? Jace? Caruso? The very same mafia boss he had been trying to build a case against for the last 2 years. The man who was his biggest target in the world of organized crime. And now, his wife was inside that man's fortress. How? Preston clenched his jaw. Why? It seems she saved Caruso's sister from a car wreck. Now she is living in his mansion on Star Island, and they are protecting her like she is family. The investigator provided more information, but Preston did not hear any of it. His mind was already racing, forming a new plan. He knew he could not get to Brooke as long as she was under Caruso's protection. He needed an insider, someone who could get into Caruso's world without setting off alarms. He needed one of Caruso's enemies. A week later, Preston was sitting in a fancy Italian restaurant in Manhattan, facing Victor Benedetto, a 60-year-old man with snow-white hair and the cold eyes of a venomous snake, the leader of the Benedetto crime family, and Caruso's bitter rival in a turf war that had been raging for years. "What is it you want, counselor?" Benedetto asked, his voice rough like grinding stones. "You are trying to put us in prison, but you are here asking for a private conversation." "Interesting." Preston slid Brooke's photo across the table. My wife is with Caruso. I want her back. Benedetto glanced at the picture, then looked back at Preston, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. I have heard about her, the woman who jumped into the canal to rescue Jace's sister. That story is all over the streets. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. If we go near her, Caruso will start an all-out war, and I have no desire to open up a new battlefront at the moment. I do not need you to touch her, Preston said carefully. I just need you to create a diversion so that I can get to her. Benedetto tilted his head, listening. You launch an attack on the Caruso compound as a distraction. While his men are busy fighting your people, I will find another way in and take my wife. Caruso will never know you were involved, other than what he already assumes. He will just think it was another one of your failed attacks. And what do I get from all of this? Benedetto asked. Inquired. Preston offered a slight smile. I am the prosecutor handling the case against you. I have the power to make that file disappear for good. A long silence settled between them. Benedetto raised his wineglass to his lips, took a slow drink, and held Preston's gaze. She is your wife, he finally said. And you have every right to bring her home. I accept your terms. We have an agreement. 2 weeks later in Miami, Gianna knocked on Brooke's bedroom door, her face glowing with a joyful smile. Her belly was much rounder now, as she was well into her 8th month of pregnancy. This weekend is Marco's baby's christening, Gianna announced. You must come. You are this family's good luck charm. Everyone is eager to meet the woman who saved my life. Brooke was hesitant. She was still not at ease in large crowds, particularly crowds full of dangerous men, but she could not refuse Gianna. I will be there, Brooke said with a smile. That morning the Miami sky was a perfect cloudless blue. Brooke stood before the mirror in her room, wearing a dress for the first time since she fled Chicago. It was a simple yet elegant pale blue dress that Gianna had picked out for her. She looked at her reflection and almost did not recognize the woman staring back. The dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights had vanished. The fear was gone from her face. She appeared calm, even happy. She had no idea that Preston was already on his way to Miami. She didn't realize that Benedetto had sent out a team, ready to attack. She couldn't know that the true storm was about to hit. The christening took place at an old Catholic church on the mainland, about a 20-minute drive from Star Island. Nearly the entire Caruso family was in attendance. From Jace, dressed in a serious black suit, to Bruno, who had the annoyed expression of someone forced into formal wear, there were dozens of men and women Brooke had slowly gotten to know over the past 3 months. Only Brooke and Gianna stayed behind at the mansion. In her 8th month of pregnancy, Gianna was too heavy and uncomfortable to get around easily, so Brooke offered to stay and keep her company. 4 bodyguards were posted around the property. Star Island was already known as the safest area in Miami, protected by its own security force and a single entry road. Nobody believed anything could go wrong on such a peaceful Sunday. Brooke and Gianna were in the first-floor living room, where glass doors opened to a view of the pool and the wide expanse of Biscayne Bay. Gianna was describing her ideas for decorating the nursery, and Brooke just listened with a smile. She had become comfortable with these kinds of conversations, the simple, everyday moments she was never allowed during her 4 years with Preston. The clock read 1 o'clock in the afternoon when an explosion rocked the front gate. Brooke jumped to her feet. There were gunshots, and then more. Not just single shots, but sustained bursts of automatic weapon fire that tore through the quiet afternoon air. Brooke rushed over to the window, and her heart felt like it stopped beating. A team of men dressed in all black was swarming through the destroyed gate. They advanced in a military-style formation, guns raised, shooting at the 4 bodyguards who were attempting to return fire. This wasn't a simple robbery. It was a planned attack. It was an act of war. Gianna ran into the room right after the first shots. Her face was completely pale with terror. What is going on? Benedetto, Brooke didn't understand how she knew, but she was absolutely certain. This had to be the rival family Jace had told her about. The very same people who tried to kill Gianna on the bridge 3 months before. We need to leave. Now. Brooke took Gianna's hand. Is there another way out? My brother's office, Gianna said, her voice shaking. There's a hidden tunnel that goes to the dock, in the back. The two women hurried down the long hall as the gunfire grew louder and closer. Brooke could hear men shouting in Italian, the sound of shattering glass, and the thud of running feet. They were already in the house. Jace's office was located at the far end of the hallway. Gianna went to the huge oak bookcase, tugged on a fake book, and the entire unit slid open, revealing a solid steel door. You should go first, Brooke told her. I am right behind you. No. Gianna shook her head firmly. We leave together. You saved my life before. I am not going to leave you here by yourself. Brooke wanted to protest, but there was no time. She had just taken a step toward the tunnel when the office door flew open. She spun around, preparing to confront the men in black. But the person who walked in was not wearing black. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit with a crisp white shirt. His sandy blonde hair was perfectly combed, and he held a pistol pointed directly at Brooke. Preston Hale. Hello, Brooke. Preston's voice was as smooth as it was toxic. I have missed you so much. Brooke was completely frozen. In the past 3 months, she had started to push that face and that voice out of her mind, along with the terror he always made her feel. But now, all of it came rushing back like a monster wave. Preston was standing in Jace Caruso's office like he owned the place. He walked further into the room, his gaze scanning everything before landing on Gianna, who was shaking next to the tunnel entrance. So, this must be Caruso's sister, Preston said with a smirk. The one my wife risked her own life to save. How interesting. She is not a part of this. Brooke moved forward, positioning herself between Preston and Gianna. Leave. She is pregnant. You cannot hurt her. Preston let out a laugh, and the sound was as cold as a winter night. I do not care about her. The only one I care about is you. 3 months, Brooke. I looked for you all over, and you were here the whole time, living like a princess in a den of thieves. You do not even need me anymore, do you? The gun in Preston's hand rose slightly, aiming right at Brooke's heart. Behind her, Gianna made a move. She was going to do something, maybe try to run or grab a phone. Brooke had no idea what, and she was too afraid to turn around and see. Do not move, pregnant lady, Preston said, his voice as sharp as a razor. Take one more step, and I will shoot my wife right here in front of you. Gianna froze. But then she did something completely unexpected. She lunged, trying to ram Preston with all the force of her 8-month pregnant frame. Preston's reaction was immediate. He shoved her backward. Gianna landed on the hardwood floor with a terrible thud, her hands instinctively going to her stomach as her face contorted in agony. Gianna! Brooke screamed and fell to her knees next to her. Gianna was on the floor, struggling for breath, her hands wrapped tightly around her pregnant belly. Preston moved forward, grabbed Brooke's hair, and pulled her viciously to her feet. A searing pain shot through her scalp. Brooke fought the urge to cry out, swallowing it down. That's enough, Preston hissed. We are leaving this instant. Wait, Brooke pleaded, keeping her voice steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. I will come with you. I will not fight. But let her stay here. She is 8 months pregnant and she took a hard fall. She needs a doctor. If you drag me away from here and she dies, Caruso will hunt you down to the ends of the earth. Preston paused. Brooke saw him calculating the odds. In that brief moment, she knelt down by Gianna one last time, acting like she was checking on her. As her hand rested on Gianna's shoulder, she slid the USB drive into the pocket of Gianna's dress. It was the drive she had kept with her this whole time, her last hidden advantage. I trust you, Brooke whispered, so softly that only Gianna could hear. Then she stood and faced Preston again. Let's go. Preston seized Brooke's arm and pulled her toward the door. The sound of gunfire was still echoing from somewhere else in the mansion, but it seemed more distant now. Benedetto's diversion was working perfectly. Brooke followed Preston, not once looking back. She heard Gianna call out her name, her voice filled with desperation and pain, but she did not let herself turn around. She knew that if she did, she would lose the courage to see this through. And if Preston found out the USB was missing, he would return and kill Gianna without a second's hesitation. Preston pulled Brooke through the garden behind the mansion, past the tall palm trees and across the manicured grass. Up ahead, the gunshots continued to ring out like a somber melody. Benedetto was doing his part, creating a distraction for everyone else. The Caruso family's private dock appeared. A white speedboat was already there, its engine idling, with a man waiting at the controls. This had been Preston's plan all along. Slip into the mansion during the attack, grab Brooke, and escape onto the water before anyone even knew what happened. Get in the boat! Preston pushed Brooke toward the dock as he barked the command. What are you planning to do with me? Brooke asked. Her heart was pounding, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Preston flashed a grin. It was a sight she recognized instantly, the cruel smirk that appeared just before he did something terrible. You are going home, back to Chicago, back to our penthouse. And this time, I will make sure you never have another chance to escape. You will stay there forever, Brooke, until I decide you can leave. Preston's grip on her arm became a vice. It was the same oppressive force that had broken her spirit for 4 long years, turning her into a frightened creature. It was the power that had convinced her she would never be free. But that version of her was gone. For the last 3 months, she had been alive, not just getting by, but truly living. She had plunged into dark water to rescue a complete stranger. She had taught herself to hold her head high and look people in the eye without flinching. She recalled the person she used to be before Preston, a confident woman who knew her own strength. And there was something else. He had made her enroll in self-defense 2 years ago, claiming it was for her own protection when he was away. In reality, it was just another method to control her schedule, to monitor her every move 3 nights a week. But she paid attention in those classes, and she never forgot the lessons. That bitter irony was about to be turned against him. Preston pushed her toward the stairs that led to the water. Move. We do not have a lot of time. Brooke walked a little way, then she pretended to trip. At least, that is what Preston thought he witnessed. She went down hard, a knee cracking against the wood as she braced herself with her hands. He let out an annoyed huff and leaned over to pull her up. In that moment, Brooke pivoted. She slammed her elbow directly into his face with all of her strength. There was a sickening crack of bone on bone. Preston stumbled back, his hand instantly covering his nose as blood poured out. The pistol he was holding fell to the dock. Brooke dove for the weapon. Her fingertips grazed the cold steel, but Preston recovered quicker. His foot slammed into her back, sending her sprawling onto the planks. His entire body weight came down on top of her, crushing and savage. You really think you can take me on? Preston growled, his face twisted with rage and smeared with blood. You think a few months with gangsters made you a fighter? His hand wrapped around Brooke's neck and tightened. Air refused to enter her lungs. Her sight started to fade, dark blotches swimming in her vision. She felt her life slipping away with each passing moment. Was this really the end? To survive so much, only to die by Preston's hand on a stranger's property? No. Brooke's hand searched desperately across the wooden surface. Her fingers found something solid. It was a small, decorative rock, but it had enough weight. She seized it and, using her final reserve of energy, brought it down hard on Preston's head. The first blow made his grip falter. The second made him release her. He fell to the side. Brooke scrambled out from beneath him, coughing and sucking in air like someone who had been pulled from a watery grave. For a moment, Preston was dazed. Then he got back on his feet, his eyes glowing with fury. He located the gun, snatched it, and pointed it at Brooke. I already warned you. His voice was like frozen steel. You will never defeat me. Never. A shot rang out, but the sound did not come from Preston's gun. He jolted as if struck by lightning, his eyes going wide with disbelief. He glanced at his left shoulder, where a red stain was blooming on his high-end gray suit. He collapsed, and the pistol fell from his grasp again. Brooke looked up. Standing at the other end of the pier was Jace Caruso. A thin wisp of smoke drifted from the gun he held. He still had on the black suit from the baptism, but his shirt was undone at the top, and a smear of blood marked his wrist. He had clearly battled to get here. Jace strode forward, sent Preston's weapon flying with a kick, and loomed over the moaning man on the ground. He lifted his pistol, pointing it directly at Preston's forehead. "No!" Brooke cried out, her voice raspy from the chokehold that had almost ended her life. "Do not kill him!" Jace did not glance at her. His gaze remained locked on Preston. "He was about to murder you. He invaded my home. He put my sister in danger. Tell me why I should not end this right now." Brooke struggled to her feet and stumbled toward Jace. "Because if you kill him, I will never be truly free." Her voice trembled, but her message was clear. He will be remembered as a victim. The world will never learn what a monster he was. He needs to face a jury. The public needs to know who he really is. They need to hear my story. That is the only way I can finally break free from him. Jace remained quiet, his finger poised on the trigger. Brooke could see the war playing out in his expression. The mob boss in him screamed for immediate vengeance, but another part of him hesitated. After a long moment, Jace finally lowered his weapon. The sound of approaching steps made them turn. Gianna was walking toward them, protecting her stomach with one arm, while her other hand held a small, dark object. The USB drive. "I have it," Gianna said, her voice shaky with lingering pain and terror. "The proof you gave me. It is more than enough to put him away forever." She gave the drive to Jace. He glanced at it, then to Brooke, and finally down at Preston, who was still on the ground whimpering. "Okay," Jace said finally. "We will handle this your way. Preston Hale is going to court, and he will spend the rest of his days rotting in a cell." The raid by the Benedetto family was over almost as soon as it started. Once Jace and his crew got back from the church, the intruders knew they had been lured into an ambush. The surprise was gone and they were outnumbered. Their only option was to flee. The Caruso family suffered 2 casualties in the shootout. 2 men Brooke had patched up herself, listening to them share stories about their loved ones. She watched as they were taken away, feeling that this new life she had found was now permanently altered. Preston Hale was bound and secured in the mansion's wine cellar. That room, filled with expensive vintages and kept at a precise temperature, was now a makeshift jail for the prosecutor who had once held Chicago in his grip. Jace descended into the cellar by himself. He observed Preston on the chilly floor, his shoulder bandaged, and his eyes a mix of pure hate and deep-seated fear. "Did you really think you could just stroll into my home?" Jace asked, his tone casual, as if talking about the day's forecast. "Harm my sister, take someone who belongs to me, and I would let it slide?" "I am a federal prosecutor," Preston growled. "If I die, the FBI will chase you to the ends of the earth." Jace cocked his head slightly, as if considering an offer. "Who mentioned anything about killing you?" "There are fates far worse than death, Preston Hale, and you are about to discover one." Later that evening, an unmarked black car pulled up to the estate's gate. The person who emerged was a petite Asian woman in her 40s, wearing a simple gray suit and sensible shoes. But her gaze was incredibly sharp, and her confident movements showed she was far from ordinary. Special Agent Monica Chen of the FBI. She was the one official Preston could never corrupt, because her deepest passion was bringing down men who hurt their wives. She stared at Preston in the cellar with a look of cold contentment. "Preston Hale," she stated. "I have been watching you for a very long time. Your convictions were always too neat. Your targets were always the enemies of particular crime families. But I could never prove it until today." She held up the USB drive and a folder with printouts of the mansion's security video. Preston bursting into the office. Preston knocking Gianna down, Preston hauling Brooke out, clear as day, enough to destroy your career and your life. 3 months after that, the trial kicked off in a Chicago federal courthouse. The media swarmed the event like predators drawn to a kill, a celebrated prosecutor exposed, a supposed guardian of the law unmasked as a crook. The story was simply too sensational to pass up. Brooke took the witness stand in a modest blue dress that Gianna had picked out for her. She recounted the entire story. She spoke of 4 years of torment, of being imprisoned in a room, of the bruises hidden where no one could see, of her escape, and of being abducted. Her voice was steady. Her eyes remained dry. She just stated the facts, one after another, as if she were detailing events from a life that was not her own. Keith also came from California to give his testimony. Her brother, looking healthy and clean, explained how Preston had held him captive to manipulate his sister. He described how Preston would threaten to stop paying for his treatment if Brooke stepped out of line, and how they were both prisoners of the same man in separate cells. The accusations mounted, one after the other. Receiving bribes from a criminal organization, conspiring with the mob, domestic abuse, kidnapping, assault with intent to harm, and breaking and entering. Every charge added another stone to the prison wall that would contain Preston Hale for the rest of his existence. Life imprisonment with no chance of parole. The judge delivered the sentence with a flat tone, as if ordering from a restaurant. Preston was ashen-faced and shaking. He turned for a final look at Brooke before being escorted out. His expression was one of absolute loathing. But Brooke was no longer afraid. Afraid anymore. She only looked back at him with a hollow kind of calm. He had no power over her now. Brooke stayed in her seat as the courtroom slowly cleared out around her. She did not cry. She did not smile. She just breathed. For the first time in years, she took a breath that was not filled with fear. Outside the courthouse, Jace Caruso was waiting next to a shiny black car. He had not come inside for the trial. That was not his world, but he was here for her. "Are you okay?" he asked when Brooke came outside. Brooke looked up at the sky above Chicago, at the city she once thought would be her grave. Now it was just a city, nothing more. "I don't even know what okay means anymore," she said, telling the truth. "But I think I will figure it out. One day at a time." Jace nodded. He opened the car door for her and did not say another word. Brooke glanced at the car, then at Jace, and then back at the courthouse behind her. She could go anywhere she wanted now. She was free. For the first time in 5 years, she was truly free. And she got in the car. Not because anyone forced her to, not because she had no other choice, but because she chose to. 2 years later, it was spring in Miami. The mansion on Star Island was glowing under the April sun, decorated everywhere with white flowers and silver ribbons that drifted gently in the sea breeze. Classical music played from a small orchestra in the garden, mixing with the soft sound of waves against the seawall in the distance. Today was the christening for Marcus, Gianna's son, the little boy Brooke had saved from the bottom of a canal 2 years ago, back when he was still in his mother's womb. Marcus was almost 2 years old now, with dark eyes just like his mother's and a smile with dimples that had the whole family wrapped around his little finger. Brooke stood on the balcony on the second floor, looking down at the garden as more guests slowly arrived below. She was not the terrified woman who had run across 3 states anymore. Nor was she the stranger they took in because they owed her their lives. Now, she was Brooks and Claire, the woman who ran the legal side of the Caruso family's real estate business. Boutique hotels, fancy restaurants, and rental properties that stretched all along the Miami coast. She handled the contracts, the oversight, and the management for all of it. It was legitimate work with a steady income, a life she never even dared to dream of. And she had her own home now, a small penthouse apartment right on the edge of the island, with a view of Biscayne Bay. It was a birthday gift from Jace last year. "You need a space of your own," he had said when he gave her the keys. "A place that belongs only to you." Not to the family, and not to anyone else. This place is yours, Brooke. Truly yours. A knock on the door pulled Brooke back to the present moment. Gianna came in, looking beautiful in a cream-colored dress. She was holding Marcus, who was wiggling around in his bright white christening outfit. Are you ready? Everybody is waiting for us. Brooke smiled and walked with Gianna downstairs and into the garden. A small altar was set up under the branches of an old banyan tree. The priest was already there, waiting in his ceremonial robes. Around the altar were familiar faces. There was Bruno, built like a bear and looking as annoyed as ever to be in a suit, though his eyes softened with love whenever he looked at the baby. Nico stood behind him. His hair was completely white now, but his back was still straight as a board. Dr. Webb sat in this front row, with a kind smile on his old face, and Keith, Brooke's brother, stood near the family's row. He looked taller and much healthier than he had at the trial. He had moved to Miami 6 months ago and was now working at a local rehab center. He was helping people fight addiction, just like he once had to. The christening unfolded with a solemn kind of warmth. When the ceremony was finished, Gianna stepped up in front of the altar, still holding Marcus in her arms. I want to say a few words, she started, her voice carried clearly in the quiet air. This is Marcus, my son, but his full name is Marcus Brooks Caruso. We gave him that middle name to honor the woman who saved both of our lives 2 years ago. Brooke felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. She had no idea. She looked at Gianna. Her eyes were already starting to burn with tears. Brooke Sinclair was not part of our family when she jumped into that dark water that night, Gianna went on. She was a stranger to us, a woman running for her life, with absolutely nothing and no one to turn to. She was in the middle of saving herself. She could have just kept driving, and nobody would have blamed her. But she did not. She jumped into that dark water to save a pregnant stranger. She put her own life on the line for someone she did not know. That is not something a stranger does. That is something family does. Gianna looked right at Brooke, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. You gave my son a chance at life. You gave me the chance to be a mother. And now, my son will carry your name for the rest of his life, so we never forget that gift. His life as a reminder of that gift. Jace Caruso came forward and stood next to his sister. He held a little black velvet box in his hand. We do not trust outsiders easily, Jace said, his voice low and steady. That is how we survive in this world. But you proved that you are not an outsider. You proved it not with words, but with your actions, with your own blood. He opened the box. Inside was a shiny silver bracelet with a single word finely engraved on it. Familia. You do not just belong to one of us, Jace said, looking directly into Brooke's eyes. You belong to all of us. This is your home, Brooke Sinclair, if you will have us. Brooke stepped forward. Her legs felt a little shaky under her. She held out her hand, and Jace clipped the bracelet around her wrist. The metal felt cool against her skin, and it fit perfectly, like it was made just for her. And that's because it was. The whole family started to clap, not in a loud way, not like a wild celebration, but with a quiet, warm dignity. It was the sound of some of the most dangerous people in Florida welcoming a new member into their family. Gianna wrapped her arms around Brooke, with Marcus squeezed happily between them. Welcome home, she whispered. Brooke hugged her back, and finally, the tears started to fall. But these tears were not like the ones she used to cry in that Chicago penthouse. These were happy tears. When they let go, Brooke looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. Familia. Family. She thought about Preston, about 4 years of absolute hell, about being locked in that room, and about those endless, fearful nights. Then she looked around. Gianna was smiling, holding Marcus in her arms. Keith was standing nearby, giving his sister a little wink. Bruno was awkwardly wiping his eyes, all while pretending he was not crying at all. And Jace was standing a little way off, leaning against the trunk of the banyan tree, just watching her with the slightest smile on his face. For the first time in her life, Brooke Sinclair knew what it felt like to truly belong. It was not because she was forced to be there or because she had no other choice. It was because she wanted to be there, with these people, with this family. Night came to Star Island with a kind of beauty that always took Brooke's breath away. She stood on the mansion's balcony, looking out over Biscayne Bay. It shimmered under the moonlight like millions of diamonds sprinkled across black water. This was the exact same water, the exact same bay. 2 years earlier, she had jumped into it to save a stranger. Now, she stood here with the silver bracelet engraved with the word Familia on her wrist, looking down at the very spot that had almost been a grave for both her and Gianna. She heard soft footsteps behind her. Gianna came and stood next to Brooke. Marcus was asleep in her arms, his little head resting on his mother's shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Brooke did not turn around. Her eyes stayed on the bay. "I was just thinking about what would have happened if I had not stopped that night." "Well, you would not be here." Brooke shook her head just a little. "No, I would still be running. I would still be scared, and I would still be all alone. I might have been alive, but I would not have been really living. I would have just been existing, one day to the next. Until Preston found me, or until I just got too tired to run anymore." Gianna did not say anything. She just stood there beside Brooke in silence. Marcus moved a little in his sleep, his lips twitching as if he was having a sweet dream. Another set of footsteps approached. Keith walked out onto the balcony with a glass of water in his hand. "Jace sent me to ask if you are ready to go home. He is waiting for you downstairs." Brooke smiled. "Tell him I will be down in a minute." Keith started to leave, but then he stopped. He looked over at his sister, and Brooke saw a look in his eyes she had never seen before. "You know, I am really proud of you. You did what I always thought was impossible. You got out, and you are living. Not just surviving, but actually living. I used to think we were both going to be trapped forever. I was trapped by addiction, and you were trapped in that marriage. But seeing you now makes me believe that anyone can change their own story." Brooke stepped forward and gave her brother a hug. They did not need to say anything. The hug and the quiet understanding said it all. They both knew they had traveled a very long and difficult road to get here. When Keith went back inside, Brooke turned to Gianna. "You know what? I think I finally get it." "Get what?" "Why I jumped into the water that night." Brooke glanced down at the bracelet on her wrist. "It was not because I was brave. I was not brave at all. It was because, in that moment, I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I had already lost it all, my identity, my freedom, even my belief in myself. So jumping into that dark water did not feel like I was risking my life. It felt like it was the only meaningful thing I had left to do." Brooke looked back out at Biscayne Bay, where the moonlight was reflecting on the water. Her eyes. "But things are different for me now. Now I have everything worth protecting. I have you and Marcus and Keith and this entire family. If someone fell into that water right now, I would still go in for them. But this time would be harder, because I would have to struggle to get back. Because now, I have things worth returning to." Gianna smiled and gave Brooke's hand a gentle squeeze before she took Marcus back into the house. Brooke stood there for another minute, taking in the salty air before she headed downstairs. The shiny black car was parked by the front gate. Jace was standing beside it, leaning casually against the door with his hands in his pockets. When he saw Brooke approach, he pushed himself upright and opened the door for her. "Going home?" Brooke glanced inside the car, then looked back at the warm, brightly lit mansion behind them. She could hear laughter coming from inside. Keith was waving at her from a window. Gianna was in the hallway rocking Marcus. Bruno was bickering with Nico over something that was probably completely unimportant. "Home," Brooke replied, and she got into the car. Brooke and Claire's story wasn't a fairy tale. No prince came charging in on a white horse to rescue her. There was no magical spell that transformed a pumpkin into a royal carriage. There was just a woman who picked life over death. A woman who chose to help someone instead of looking the other way, who picked trust over fear. She did not find family with the people she was born to. She did not find love in the place she once believed was safe. Instead, she found both in the very place where she almost died. And sometimes that's exactly how families are created. Not through blood ties, and not through marriage, but through choice. They are built in the moments that change everything. They are built by jumping into dark water to save a complete stranger, only to find out that this stranger will become the person who means the most to you. If you have not yet subscribed to our channel, please take a moment to subscribe and activate notifications so you do not miss out on the incredible stories we share with you each day. We would really love to hear what you thought about Brooke's journey. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Have you ever faced a single decision that had the potential to alter the course of your life? We invite you to share your own thoughts and feelings in the comments section below. We read every single comment, and we truly hope to hear about the stories that you carry in your own hearts. We wish everyone watching this video the best of health, a life full of joy, and many peaceful days ahead. Always remember, you can never tell which small choice you make might just change someone else's life, and maybe even your own. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.